Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. I'm Nick Thomas.
And I'm Esther Gibson.
I'm bringing you answers to your questions. So this is part 2, doing 18 questions per video, so there'll be 3 videos. And over to you.
Okay, so first question for this video is, I've always wondered about the influence of Indian and even Filipino-Indonesian combat techniques on British military fencing, especially naval fencing.
So in short, I've not heard of any. British swordsmanship took influence from a lot of areas, but as far as I've always seen, it's always been European in origin. So I've not seen any note of that. And you would think there would be perhaps more influence with the Navy. Of course, Britain has always been always for hundreds of years been a powerful naval nation. And perhaps they would take more, but as far as what we've got recorded in naval swordsmanship, with things like Bringle Green, Angelo, and some of the stuff that was around the sort of 1860s, 1870s, it just seems to be essentially simplified methods of what was being done in the army. So I don't know of any, and I've not seen anything like that. So certainly there is influence drawn from, France, Hungary, Austria, that kind of thing. But no, and I haven't seen any of that at all. If there is any, I would like to know though, because that would be quite fascinating.
So even with the Shamshir bladed sabers, they didn't really adopt any of the, say, some of the Mamluk styles. They kept their British tradition.
As far as we know, no, things like the Shamshir swords had absolutely no influence whatsoever on British swordsmanship. Of course, the curved blades of the Napoleonic period generally did in terms of some of the thrusting techniques, but in terms of what that was, as far as we know, being developed in Britain and throughout Europe. As far as what I've read with things like the way Mamluks were fighting, I don't think any of that was adopted whatsoever or had any influence.
Fair enough. Okay, moving on. Is there an interpretation of Angelo's preparatory movements?
So I've not ever done one and haven't planned to. And the reason for that is we've always done army-based combat. And naval is more recent to us, even though they're very closely related. But until we started working on Pringle Green, we didn't do any naval swordsmanship. And the Angelo preparatory movements only appear in the Napoleonic period in the cutlass poster. And then they don't appear until 1816, so after the Napoleonic War has ended. They then get adopted into the Angelo infantry manual, which you can get that one freely on our website as well, because I've got an original copy that I scanned. And as a result, because it wasn't being done in army-based training for the Napoleonic period, we've never done it. Now we've moved on to some naval stuff. Could we adopt it from the Angelo 1813, I think it is, poster? Yes, so we might adapt it. I will say, though, that I'm pretty sure that JMass has done a video on it, so check his channel out, because I'm pretty sure he did a video on that.
Okay. So what are the differences between the British swordsmanship of the Napoleonic era and later Victorian era, such as Musgrave Waite, and why did it change?
Okay, so I don't study Musgrave Waite, but I have read through it, and I've fenced with people that practice it, because of course Scholar use Musgrave Waite. So I know enough about it to talk about it. And what changed? Well, the body weighting tended to be more forward weighting as you go into the latter parts of the 19th century. And Musgrave Waite loves his engaging guard, which is, funnily enough, not so different to how it's described that the French used spadroon. So the spadroon French guard is like this. Shoulder height, pointing forward, and Musgrave's Waite engaging guard is not much different. And I think there might be a clue there as to why and how things were changing. So that when you get Roeth's manual, he's looking at broadsword and saber and everything else, and there's still all that influence from the broadsword masters of the 18th century. Whereas when you get into the latter parts of the 19th, I think there's increasingly a focus on point work especially. And they're generally using slightly longer blades as well. And I think, therefore, you see with the introduction of, well, I say the introduction, but the popularity of the spadroon did seem to come with a focus on more and more point work in military swordsmanship, and I think it's no surprise then that as you go into, say, the Victorian period, they're using more point forward guards, more point work, and I think it's all related. In which case, forward weighting can in many ways work better. The slip won't be necessarily so important anymore, because once you use forward weighting, the legs are a bit more protected anyway, because you're pushing the sword further forward from your legs. It's still, the British forms at that point, they're still in the same lineage, so there's still loads in common. If you compare things like muscular weight to rope, there's still plenty in common. But yeah, a few fundamental things like taking the slip out of normal parries happened. And yeah, that engaging guard, although again it's not so different to the way that the spadroon is described as it's used in France, which is then clearly a recommendation for how to use the spadroon in Britain. So yeah, there's some differences, but there's a ton of similarities as well.
Okay. Quite a long one. When I watch your sparring videos, it comes across as very calm and cool and measured between skilled opponents. The blade movements are small and quick, and it doesn't look like you're trying to kill one another. Whilst impressive, one can't help but feel that there is a lack of realism, as the emotional intent to try and hurt or kill one another isn't there. So how well do you think HEMA sword training prepares people for the rigours of real-life death combat, and how well did it prepare infantry officers in the 19th century or cavalry saber fighters for the real combat, when they had to put their skills to the test against bloodthirsty opponents with live, sharp blades, who perhaps are less skilled but possessed more murderous intent, and were not inclined to follow texts or rules of manuals?
So there's a lot in that. There's a lot in that. Oh, first of all, sparring footage. Sparring is not all supposed to be a simulation of a real fight. Not every sparring bout is, say, a duel or representing a battlefield combat. Sparring is inherently a training tool, and there are various different reasons and ways you will spar. So most of our sparring videos are fairly competitive, but we're not trying to destroy one another. We are learning and honing our skills and things like that. So there is some competitiveness to pretty much all sparring footage, but it's not everyone is intended to be all out, and that depends essentially on who's in them, what approach they're taking, how far they want to push it on that particular night, and you will see a whole spectrum from a light friendly sort of fight to a much more aggressive one, and there'll be a whole spectrum. And that is because, again, sparring is a training tool. You can take sparring up to a much heavier, more realistic level. In terms of the movements seemed sort of small or whatever else and controlled, well, that's the methods that were being taught according to what we're using. They were small and controlled. If you look at the HEMA at Home series, which is how British military swordsmanship was being taught, it was designed to be refined with small movements that keep you protected, and specifically avoiding the huge, big arm-swinging cuts that, yes, would deliver devastating power and horrific injuries, but leave huge openings. And when you get to cavalry combat, you will see a lot more of those big hacks coming in. But when it comes to infantry combat, if you use big motions, you create big openings. And especially as timed shots and thrust work was just being used so much at that time, you create those huge openings on yourself when you use them. So it's not so much about we don't want to hit each other full power, it's that we don't want to create the openings that allow time shots, thrusts and that kind of thing. So that's more what it's about. Now, how would it prepare somebody for fighting somebody who went a bit wilder? So let's say some of the Tolvar users, for example, were known to just go in with fury and power. And how well would this system prepare someone for that? Well, I would say pretty well. I mean, that's what it's designed for. So the military swordsmanship stuff that we do, none of it is fancy. If you look at the guards and the postures and the movement, none of that is for show. It is essentially mathematically calculated to be defensive from the very beginning. So it's done for a reason. There's no show, no fanciness, no nothing like that. It is just a method devised to be efficient and effective. So how well would it work? Well, very well. So essentially, we teach our people to not swing wildly, but to be able to defend against those who do. And I've sparred with all manner of people, some that go really light and really slow, some that come in that want to just cave my head in. And personally, I've found that it works absolutely fine, but you do want to be sparring against those people from time to time so that you know how to handle it, because yes, it can be a bit of a shock if people train differently to your usual methods, which is why you should spar with a whole range and mix of different people as often as you can.
So, if someone disengages from your middle, inside, outside guard to cut at your arm, you advocate a half circle guard or half hanger depending on your position. Do you step back further when you make the second guard or not? Do you ever make full passes instead of just a slip? When to use a Matheson slip rather than a Roworth one pass, do you ever do a half step to Roworth and then second step to Matheson position on a second parry?
Yes, okay. So yeah, there's a lot in that as well. Firstly, about making the second parry after you've slipped and parried. In the system, that shouldn't happen. Of course, it does happen, because people shouldn't be doing 2 attacks on 1 lunge, and yet there are people that do it, and there are people that double up and just throw frantically 1 strike after another. So, according to the method, after you've parried, you should be responding, and they should be protecting and going to guard. But yes, people don't always do that, of course. In the event that you make a slip and parry, and they launch another attack, first of all, time them. That's a good opportunity because you've got your strong position. So, you know, you slip back into an inside guard and they try and go to your other opening. Just go straight down the middle and time them. I mean, that's what timed shots are for. They're absolutely ideal. If you absolutely have to parry, because there are times when you've just got to go to guard and defend yourself, well, if they have stayed in their lunge position, then your distance remains the same. So your slip, you're in the right distance to parry as is. You should only have to take a second step if they've closed more distance. So yeah, stay in guard if they are in their lunge position, or move back if they come in further. And that's where I personally find the Matheson slip really quite effective, because with the Matheson slip, the right foot passes behind the left, and it means that you can, if they cover more distance, you can just pass back with your left foot and go back into a guard or then in a slip position after it. So I wouldn't go from the Roworth slip to the Matheson slip, but I would consider using the Matheson slip more, particularly against taller fighters. People have more reach. I really like the Matheson slip. And if you find yourself in the standard Roworth slip position and being attacked again, just step back or traverse is absolutely fine. So it depends whether they're stepping in with their second strike. Does that cover all of that?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so Eastern very curved sabers that come from the plains of Asia are often considered as the major influence for the saber and the cutlass. But as swords that had knuckle bows and are around the 30-inch length, that are cut and thrust weapons which have a single edge, are curved already in existence in England as early as the coat of plates start to evolve, is it not most likely that this sword type is most likely the progenitor of the English Army and Navy side swords?
Yeah, so basically, do our British sabres come from sort of Central Eastern Europe, or do they come from the military swords we already had? The answer is sort of a mix of the two. So yes, if you go to the 15th century especially, you see a whole range of swords that we would now usually call a falchion. And they're single-edged, they have some curve either to the blade or to the true edge. And yeah, they tend to have an actual knuckle bow on them. Essentially the sort of S-shaped guard that you see on this Squadron, just without the shells. And yeah, it is the origin of our sabers. I would say sort of, because yes, you see that progression of utilitarian military swords in Britain. And say if you go into the mid-17th century, there was actually major cottage industry production of short sword hangers that you think of, they'd be like cutlasses basically, which again, they're very saber cutlassy. And I think there is a progression of that. and then I think we get an influence from certain factors that come in from elsewhere, such as the back straps. So, for example, most British swords have pommels on them until the late 18th century. And then we see, you think these actually are two of the same regulation sword from the same era. This is the transition point where the back strap comes in, and yet this back strap is kind of really typical of, sort of Polish and Austrian sabers of decades before. So, and I think, basically, there were influences coming in that affected the evolution of swords that were already being made effectively. So it's a bit of both.
Okay. So high neck, I am aware that there was discourse about the merits of a curved saber compared to a straight thrusting blade for British cavalry in the Napoleonic era. Can you explain the arguments of why one was better over the other for mounted combat?
Yeah. So the Napoleonic era cavalry are famous for obviously two swords, the 1796 light cavalry and the 1796 heavy cavalry, and they are completely different weapons. The light cavalry saber is very curved and with a broad flared tip and just a stirrup hilt, and the heavy cavalry is straight with it's close to a bowl guard, but it's not made that way. It's essentially flat sheet steel that's been formed. So they're completely different weapons. And why? Now, the officer who was behind the development of the light cavalry saber was insistent that everybody adopt his new light cavalry saber, but the heavy cavalry held on to their old blades because it was tradition, effectively, I think is the main reason. Heavy cavalry, essentially dragoons, heavy dragoons for the British, had been using some form of broadsword, effectively, or backsword for the 18th century, usually in the form of a basket hilt of some kind. So I think they wanted to keep on with their tradition. But in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of each, well, you've got to look at what is the intended purpose of light and heavy cavalry. And heavy cavalry is designed essentially as a blunt instrument. Get in there and fight with almost anything, other cavalry, infantry, anything. Light cavalry are designed for harassing, scouting, that kind of thing. So they should be doing scouting, going after enemy artillery, chasing down fleeing troops, taking on skirmishers. Heavy cavalry, they're almost like your knights. They are a blunt instrument. Bigger horses, bigger men, bigger swords. Get in there and battle it out. Now, the light cavalry blade is a better cutter. The heavy cavalry is a better brawler. It has more hand protection, it has more reach, and it's better for point work once the shape of the tip has been redone, because the initial shape was a hatchet that was quite blunt, and if you shape it better or change it to a spear point, it then becomes quite a good thrust-in sword. So essentially, the light cavalry is better at hacking down skirmishers and artillerymen and that kind of thing, and the heavy cavalry is a better brawler for once you get into a fight. And if you get into a fight with a load of cuirassiers, for example, you're going to want the heavy cavalry over the light cavalry. Okay?
So I wonder if it's naturally harder to do cut 3 compared to other cuts. I feel like I could never perform a quick cut 3 with correct edge alignment if I use the thumb up grip. Do some systems dispose of cut 3?
Right, so cut 3, this is the ascending cut along this line. And I recently made a video about all the 6 cuts in Roth, and I talked about the 3. And yes, I mentioned it is the hardest one. In terms of your body mechanics, it is the hardest one, as opposed to the other ascending cut 4, which is completely natural and easy. Yeah, cut 3, it requires a supple grip. It's harder to get edge alignment. It's just awkward for the human body to do by comparison. I don't like the thumbs up grip for it. Personally, and I did talk about this in the grip video, I like a version that is of the handshake grip, which is sort of thumbs up, but you're more onto the side of the grip rather than onto the back of it. I find that slightly nicer. So you've got to stay nice and supple. You see where my grip is now, I'm almost thumbs up, but I'm more sort of handshaky with it. And then you'll find that it will scoop up quite nicely. Although some of our members, I've noticed, do actually still use hammer grip for it. They just tend to sacrifice a little bit of reach by doing it that way. But both can work. So yeah, stay nice and supple on it. And personally, I like the handshake grip for doing cut 3.
Okay.
Oh, and did any systems dispense of it? Not that I've known about. I mean, simplified systems like naval systems, for example, tend to reduce the number of cuts and points of thrusts and guards and everything. But I don't think that was because of, say, that problem. I think it's just a general simplification, just reduce down the number of everything that you are doing. And in terms of that cut 3 mechanic, I mean, that cut 3 is in so many forms of swordsmanship. It's really, really common. So, no, I think you just need to get used to it. Do more practice, change your grip a little bit.
Yeah, agreed. So, what is your favourite or preferred saber, or the one that you are best with, and why? Which one would you pick if you had to for the 19th century actions, and which would you pick for today if there was, just you and no rule of law?
Right, so, yeah, again, whenever you ask about a best sword, you need to outline some parameters as to what actually is best, because there are so many factors in terms of wearing it, carrying it, its level of protections, it's how open it is for your grip. There are so many things, and then how good you want it to be for point work, how heavy you want it to be on the cuts. There's so many factors. But my personal feeling is that something of a medium length that is agile in cut and thrust is generally the best way to go. So I like blades that are somewhere between 30 and 33 inch. I like balances that are good enough for a good cut, but not monstrously forward. So a balance of something like 5 inches is quite good. Up to 6 is good. Once you push past 7, they become a little bit clumsy. And in terms of protection, well, obviously you want more protection. Everybody wants more hand protection, but you always sacrifice the comfort for wear. So, my favourite sword, as I've already said, is the 1803 of this period. It's generally my favourite regulation sword. It has a good amount of hand protection, it has a good cut, and in this particular example, still good reach. One of my best with, well, if I was to choose a saber for most fights, I would actually choose something a bit straighter. I would go with something like maybe a 3-bar saber with a 33-inch blade, or a bowl hilt of some kind, because ultimately, a bowl hilt is not attractive, but it's very efficient, and 33-inch is well suited to most occasions. And so when it comes to the Napoleonic period, I would choose an 1803 of this kind of spec, and when it comes to today with no rule of law, I would probably go with something like a 3-bar or a bowl with a 33-inch blade that was, a little bit under 2.2 pounds, sort of 1 kilo range, something like, 850, 900 grams. That would be my preference.
Cool. How does British military swordsmanship differ from Swedish saber?
I know so little about Swedish saber that I absolutely am not the one to answer that question for you, because I've just never had an interest in it. I've sparred with a few guys that do Swedish saber, and I found that they do lots of rotational openings, a bit like Maya would do with side sword, which is kind of interesting, or Maya's rapier if you like. So maybe that's part of the style, but I'm not sure, and I don't know how he interpreted it, or the people I've fought with it. So yeah, I absolutely don't know on that one, I'm sorry.
Okay, so will we ever see Mike's longsword versus Nick's saber?
Probably not. As you noticed if you watch this channel, we like to do lots of videos of one weapon versus another weapon. I absolutely love doing that. I think it's vital, and we should be doing more of it, because so rarely were weapons matched historically outside of duels. So, but why wouldn't you see that one? Well, we tend to like to match weapons that either did meet and fight against one another, or likely could have. So a katana facing a military saber is, or a rapier, for example, because the katana was in use for so long, is completely plausible, and we know did happen. Longsword is obviously on the way out through by the time you get to the sort of mid to late 16th century, it's largely a sort of a sportive weapon when you get to things like Maya in 1570. And the saber at that time is just not around as far as Britain is concerned, not in the saber as we know it from, the Napoleonic period. It's just so far removed. I'd be inclined to do something like a dussac, a tessac if you like, the military dussac, against a longsword. I think that would be cool. But it's just too far removed for me to want to do it. It's not. They wouldn't have ever met, British military swordsmanship and that. something like George Silver's backsword versus a longsword just about is in time frame, and yeah, maybe I could do that. I'm not a George Silver practitioner, but you know, it's still a similar kind of weapon, so it could do something like that possibly.
Okay. So if 19th century British officers had served in Japan, how would they fare against samurai in armour?
In armour?
Armed with katana.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, katana versus anything is always a fascinating debate. Now, British officers in the 19th century facing the Japanese is obviously not that's going to be that common because the Japanese were so isolationist for that period. But there was some contact with Europeans, and if you look into Kinsley's book, he talks about British civilians and officers encountering the Japanese and talking about their methods. I've never actually seen an account of combat, but they have described how certain combats have gone and described their respect for the Japanese with their katana. And they talk about how sharp their blades are. They talk about how lightning fast their cut on drawing the sword is. And the one account specifically mentions that the Japanese tend to beat even a pistol, even when it was in hand, from drawing their katana. So if it was a situation where you were fairly close and you both had to draw, the katana will destroy most European swordsmen because they, you know, at that time they were training for it, the swords were suited to it, and we know they were very good at it. Once it gets to a point where both swords are drawn, it's obviously going to come down to the skill of the individual fighters, because both the saber and the katana are good swords. Neither is magical or wonderful or special. They are both very good, and it's going to come down to the individual skill, and it's very hard to say what even average skill was for swordsmen of either point at that time. The accounts do also mention that the Japanese weren't doing any thrusts. They were doing cut-based swordsmanship only. Now, we know from other periods and other accounts that they were thrusting, but certainly at that time, I think it was the 1870s, what they were encountering was cut-based fencing only. And we know that the British, facing other styles that did only cut-based swordsmanship, in India, for example, were finding that their point work was really working well against them. So clearly at a distance, the British swordsmen, as long as they're skilled, would have an advantage. They've got a longer blade, more reach, they're using point work, stuff like that. But obviously the aggression at closing distance with the Japanese swordsmen at that time would potentially be a problem. So how would they fare? It's going to come down to individual skill. Absolutely either sword can win that fight. It's down to the individual skill of the user there. And yeah, so at range, the saber adds advantage, up close, katana.
So what is your opinion on sabers made by the Universal Swords brand? What brands do you think make the best reproductions of sharp military sabers?
So Universal Swords, they're sold under a few different brand names, but Universal obviously is the maker, and they look quite good. As wall hangers, as costume pieces, as non-combat reenactment type stuff, they look good. But in terms of how they handle and how they compare to originals, generally poor. And the reason for that is that they lack distal taper. So distal taper is the change in thickness of the blade from here to here, and they don't tend to have much of it. And originals also tend to have complex distal taper as well, which they also don't have. So complex it means it doesn't just say go from 8mm to 1mm in a straight line. It would probably, like this for example, starts at 8, it tapers in fairly quickly and then carries on. So that's complex distal taper. And they lack they don't have much distal taper, they lack complex distal taper, and then as a result they tend to have loads of mass up here. So when, say, most original spadroons are 1mm here, most of those are more like 2, I believe, or even 3, and that means they've got an immense amount of mass up here. So for example, the Universal spadroon of this kind balances at, I think it's 17 centimetres. So even though total weight is only a little bit over, they got mass in all the wrong places. And that carries true for all of the swords I've seen in the Universal range. I've seen the 1796 heavy cav, light cav, a few of their French swords, and they all tend to have a ton of mass in the end of the blade. So the overall weight tends to be not far off, usually a little bit too much, but not terrible, but the mass, where the mass is is the mass distribution is all wrong. So if you want it to handle like the original swords or be particularly agile, they're not good. Now, which are good? There aren't many that are very good. Cold steel are just about acceptable, and particularly if you modify them, they can be better. They're still not great on the distal taper and the complex distal taper. They still tend to be a bit clumsy compared to the originals, but nothing like as bad as universal. But that's it. Cold steel is the only one that's making sharps of military swords that I think are okay. They're still not great. Most of the time, you're better just buying originals. So yeah, there you have it.
Is the lack of distal taper a cost thing, or is it an effort thing?
With cold steel, I think they just want tough swords that you can just beat around in the garden and not get damaged. And obviously, with original swords, yes, durability is a factor, but we also want agility to be able to actually, be quick in a fight. So I think cold steel has emphasised durability over handling. And universal, I just don't think they care. I think they've gone for something that looks sort of like the original sword without matching it. They could easily do a much better job, and they should do a better job. So yeah.
Okay. So from any British military swords from the mid-1700s onward, which would be your favourite to face a musket and bayonet combination, and which would be your least favourite, and why?
Right, so fighting against a musket, which is essentially a unwieldy spear, basically. I've done a fair bit against it, and my preference is to have a fairly long blade with a sword that is not too heavy. So, as an earlier example, side swords I've found to be very effective against spears because they're long enough to be able to catch the spear, but they're agile enough to avoid their quick disengages. So, if we now take it to this period, my least favourite would be a very heavy broadsword. So if you look into the 18th century, some of the broadswords can be 1.5, 1.7 kilos, something like that. And they're not especially long. I mean, the blades, they can be 32, 33 inch, sometimes 34. And they are brutish and heavy. And when you're fighting something like a spear, and in this case a bayonet, the biggest problem you've got, besides the obvious reach disadvantage, is that they're constantly disengaging and avoiding your blade. So you're constantly hunting to try and get the engagement. And if you've got something cumbersome and heavy, they're just going to, they're going to run circles around you and stab you. And if you've got something too small, like a little hanger like this, that can also be a problem because although it's fast, it's a short blade, so they can work around it quite easily. So my preference would be something that has the length of a broadsword but isn't as heavy as a broadsword, which basically means a decent spadroon, a good infantry saber. So this is a well-spec'd spadroon of a good weight. It's a good light backsword. This is actually quite a good weapon to face a bayonet. I'd actually prefer a few more inches again. So like some of the 35-inch bladed infantry sabers that go into the 19th century, although again you've gone past the period. Yeah, some of the shearing swords, some of the spadroons, they'll all be quite good. Also, a decent backsword would also be good because this is much. It looks like much the same weapon as a Highland broadsword, but it's light, and this is under a kilo, so it's got good length, good protection, and is fast. Essentially, this is a meteor spadroon, if you like. So that would also be quite good.
Obviously, is that out of period, that backsword?
That one actually is from about 1620 approximately, although there were backswords still very similar to that by the time you get into the 18th century. In fact, a lot of the regimental Scottish basket hilts, those were made mostly, they were made in Birmingham and London, they were roughly that specification. So they looked a bit more Scottish, but they were backswords with that kind of specification. So actually, there you go, the regimentally produced backsword, Scottish, they were still called broadswords at that point, even though they were backswords. That would actually be a really good sword for fighting a bayonet.
Okay. We've kind of touched on this vein before, but if you're a British officer and you could buy any sword pattern you wanted for the Napoleonic to Victorian era, which one would you buy?
See, we have touched on it. I know the 1803 is my favourite. If I was in the Napoleonic period and I could choose to buy any sword, I would actually buy a 1796 heavy cavalry officer's sword. Now, the heavy cavalry officer is known as a clumsy brute, and that's not actually entirely fair. But avoiding that for a moment, because we're going to get on tangent, the officers' versions with the kind of ladder-style hilt, they look gorgeous, and specification-wise, they tend to actually be a really good sword. So you can get like a 34, 35-inch bladed spear point with a nice ladder hilt. It's got great protection, and yet they're often light. They're not heavy brutes. I've seen examples in the 800 to 900 gram range. So you've got something that has a good cut, a good thrust, excellent protection, good reach. It's all round a fantastic sword. So actually, that would be my preference for fighting on foot and on horseback. It would actually be a really good sword. And ultimately what that is it's a really good backsword.
Fair enough. So what are the best infantry and cavalry design swords? Kind of answered that a little.
Yeah, once again, when you ask what are the best, it's what are the parameters for the best. And there's just no way to say that. In fact, there are merits to all of the infantry and cavalry designs that I can think of the period. There aren't bad ones. I mean, people criticise certain ones for certain reasons. I think the heavy cavs called clumsy, and the cuirassier swords are also considered clumsy and lacking in cut ability. And the reality is that's not quite true. So there are some massive merits to the various swords used in the period. Unsurprisingly, really. I mean, they didn't just equip themselves with rubbish swords. They went with what they thought would be best according to the doctrine they were using. So I wouldn't like to call the best. Certainly, yeah, I wouldn't do that.
No, that's fair.
I actually like quite a variety, though.
Yeah, hello. Right, so I'm curious about uniforms and specific functionality we might not tune into with our modern perceptions.
Yeah, that is interesting, is how equipment can affect what we're doing. And obviously armour was not really worn in the Napoleonic period, bar some notable exceptions like cuirassiers, which were rare. So armour is generally not something we have to worry about. But what factors? Well, one of the biggest ones is footwear. Although my experience, what's more important to do with that is the terrain that you're fighting on. So I've got a lot of historical footwear, and I think it's more important that you train on different surfaces more than having to train in historical footwear. But it's a consideration. How would much of the equipment affect things? Well, movements, not especially. Most of that historical clothing is quite easy to move in. It doesn't offer huge amounts of protection, more than you would necessarily expect. Although things like leather stocks around the neck is an interesting one, because that could provide cut protection to the neck, which is a curious one. With naval combat, some armour was used that could be of interest, like boarding helmets, which are steel or steel-ribbed helmets, which protected the head and the shoulders, and steel vambraces that sometimes were worn. So that's an interesting factor. So that is some armoured elements to consider. But yeah, generally I don't think we have to worry too much. The clothing that we're sparring in is not vastly different to the clothing they were wearing. Now, in terms of the protection that it offers, well, the wool tunics, they're not especially substantial. But when you've got blades that are fairly light, like some spadroons, would the jacket provide enough protection against some of the cuts you deliver with this? Quite probably. But I think we need to do a load more tests on that to really find out. I've done some tests with cuts against fabric, and it's kind of an interesting one, but I just need to see more to understand how that would work. But yeah, if I was taking a spadroon into combat with somebody with a thick wool coat, personally I wouldn't aim for their torso with a cut. I would use the cut to more exposed areas, which would still be things like the legs, because a lot of the trousers weren't too thick at the time. But yeah, I think the main thing is just a consideration of terrain more than anything, more than the uniforms.
Final question for this video. Who is the best source for English Napoleonic martial arts, and who is the worst?
We did touch on this actually. Is Roath is by far my favourite, because it's in the Napoleonic period. It's the most in depth, and I think it just it works well with all the different weapons. It explains how methods can change with the different weapons, and it's just easy to work with, I would say, compared to a lot. In terms of worst source, I mean, there aren't that many sources, that many British infantry sources in the period, so I don't think there are necessarily any bad ones. I think Gordon's manual is strange. I I think it includes too many thrust-in terminology. The bayonet work is weird, and yet it's still quite an interesting source. But I wouldn't recommend that one, certainly as one to start with anyway. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily a worst manual. It's not as good as what else is out there compared to things like Roworth and Matheson and stuff like that.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the end of part 2. So I shall see you on the next video.
See you in the next one.